Hello and welcome to the CIPD Festival of Work webinar from the Open University. This is on the future of the worker and implementing learning and development solutions. I am the head of new business at the Open University, and joining me is Dr. Jamie Woodcock, who is a senior lecturer in management at the OU and a recognized expert on the gig economy. I think in terms of context, we've seen most rapidly over the last couple of months with COVID-19 situation, organizations have had to adapt rapidly to a very changing workplace. We've seen the shift from the regular 9-to-5 office environment towards a home environment with all the challenges that go with that, with balancing family life, with balancing other commitments, right down to getting your Wi-Fi working. And what we've seen is that whilst that gives, on many reflections, employees a better work-life balance, it allows them to do less commuting time, they have greater flexibility. So now we have already seen that surveys and recent indications are looking for people not to necessarily return back to the same old norm, but possibly to look at what is a new normal and how do they adapt. And I think this is opening challenges for organizations that are considering how do they make some of the changes that they made on this temporary basis to cope with the current situation permanent. Now, flexibility is, whilst new to many organizations, is not necessarily new to the gig economy. That idea of flexible working has been used within the gig economy for a number of years. And so the challenge here is what can we learn from how the gig economy works, flexibility within the gig economy, and can those traits be implemented in the wider working world? And joining me today is Dr. Jamie Woodcock, so I will hand over to Jamie now to talk more about the gig economy and provide some insight into the advantages and disadvantages.
It's a pleasure to come and speak about this topic, and it also feels quite appropriate to be talking about the gig economy and platforms whilst we're all logging in from different places to try and speak online. What I'm going to talk about in this short talk is how we can understand the gig economy and what kind of implications it has for work beyond platforms. So what are the kind of wider implications? So on the next slide, I'm going to talk in this presentation about some research that I conducted with a colleague of mine, Professor Mark Graham, about the gig economy. Between the two of us, we've conducted about 10 years of field work in platform work and in the gig economy in the UK, in the US, in India, and in South Africa. And what we really tried to do with this book was to understand shifts in what's happening with work, with how people access work, with the role of platforms, many that people will be familiar with, Uber and Deliveroo and so on, but also the huge growth in online work and new kinds of work. Now on the next slide, this is a part of the book about where we kind of try to discuss where the gig economy comes from. And I think, often when we talk about platforms and we talk about the gig economy, there's a focus on the technology involved. The rise of algorithms at work, logging into platforms on smartphones and so on. And what I really want to draw attention to here is that the gig economy certainly has been driven by technology in various ways. But what Mark and I argue is that it's really important to also look at what we call the social factors and the factors in political economy. And so we've drawn up a list of these 9 different preconditions that shape the emergence of the gig economy, which involves things like how digitally legible work can be, how easy it is for it to be converted into platform work, but also looking at things like how customers want to access services, their own preferences, previous relationships around the racialization and gendering of work, but also the context from where this work emerges. So thinking in particular about the differences in state regulation, how services like transport are already regulated, and thinking about worker power and worker voice. So the way that workers reshape their work in various ways. And so the argument that we're making here is that the gig economy is not a singular phenomenon. It's not a single thing. And that these preconditions shape how the gig economy emerges, whether it's in London, Bangalore, Cape Town, or San Francisco. And that there has to be attention paid to these different factors because it can tell us about the relative benefits or the relative challenges, the strengths and weaknesses of the gig economy in various ways. And I think quite importantly, it also tells us that the gig economy is not an answered question. There are still changes that happen in the gig economy. Now, on the next slide about the scale of the gig economy, about whether the gig economy came from and how many people are involved, is, I'm sure many people in the virtual audience might have heard figures about how many people work on platforms or how many people work in the gig economy. And I've put up on the slides here one of the estimates that is by 2025, 540 million people will be working via online platforms. Guy Standing has a similar estimate that a third of all what he calls labor transactions, so work relationships happening online, that will happen through platforms. As a kind of estimate, in the UK, some of the figures are that over 1 million people already work in the gig economy. And this is broadly equivalent to the number of people that work in the National Health Service. So whilst the gig economy is not taking over everything, there are still many jobs that happen, of course, that are not part of the gig economy. It is nevertheless a growing and important part of how many people work today. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between conventional work and work in the gig economy. And Mark and I developed this kind of framework for understanding different kinds of work that runs across two axes. The first is how geographically sticky the work is. So thinking here about, does the work need to happen in a particular place? So you can think here about how nursing or teaching, for example, are very geographically sticky kinds of work. We want as a patient or as a student to be in the same location. Now, of course, some kinds of work in the gig economy are very geographically sticky. We want our pizza to arrive hopefully from relatively nearby, so it's still warm. We want to get a taxi from nearby so we don't have to wait for a very long time. But what's different about these new kinds of geographically sticky forms of work in the gig economy is that the duration of the jobs tends to be very short. So unlike conventional employment, where we might expect longer term contracts, people are instead only employed for the duration of the task that they're being engaged for. On the other hand, we can see less geographically sticky forms of work, which can be mediated on platforms. On the one hand, there are forms of freelance work. So we might think about designing a website, graphic design or other forms of work, where there might be repeated interactions and a longer work relationship. And platforms like Upwork or Freelancer have become very common for this kind of work. Then in the kind of bottom left-hand quarter of the diagram is a new kind of platform work, which is these very short duration jobs that can happen from anywhere. And the kind of famous example of this is Amazon Mechanical Turk, where incredibly short tasks that take a minute or two to complete, transcription or identifying things in images. And there is a huge growth of this kind of work, which is in many ways very, very different to traditional forms of employment. And on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about some of the field work that I've done over the past few years. And here, I want to start by talking about the experience that workers have when they do this kind of geographically sticky work. And in particular, I want to draw attention to a quote here from Connor, a pseudonym for a delivery driver that I interviewed a number of times in London. And Connor and I talked at length about what the work was like, what it was like to deliver food across London on a bicycle, logging onto a smartphone to do so. And as you can see in the quote, there are some challenges for Connor. I remember being particularly struck by this comment he made, that one of the biggest challenges for him in the work was that he worked a number of other jobs, in a typical gig economy kind of way, around Deliveroo. And that one of the biggest challenges he had was finding the time to eat enough so that he could do the cycling to deliver other people food. And I think particularly in the context of London, there is a kind of a deep irony that one of the biggest challenges a worker who is delivering food has is finding the time and the energy to eat enough so that he can deliver food to people who are struggling to find the time to make food and so on. And of course, there are many challenges when we think about this kind of work in the context of a place like London. But I want to draw attention in the next slide to the differences in this kind of work between the global north, so Europe, North America, and so on, and the global south. And I think here, the experience of people like Connor or transport drivers in the UK or the US or so on is often a kind of leveling down of employment rights. So this kind of work brings flexibility, of course, but also involves losing traditional protections that employment might have offered. So access to minimum wages, holiday pay, sick pay, trade union representation, and so on. But does offer, the flexibility to work around other jobs and so on. And this is quite a different experience to many workers in the global south who are entering onto platform work. And in a sense, we can think about, from a global south perspective, a kind of leveling up rather than a leveling down, because many workers, particularly on transport platforms or cleaning platforms, may never have had formal employment before. So this is a movement from informal work into slightly more formal work, whereas in the global north, it is a kind of informalization in various ways. But I think what is kind of remarkable from the interviews that I've done is that there are very, very similar stories that emerge, whether people are working in Bangalore, in Cape Town, or in London, and similar challenges that this new kind of work brings for people. And so on the next slide, I want to focus on one of these in particular, which is flexibility. Whenever I've spoken to gig economy workers, one of the things that is always stressed in interviews is the importance of flexibility. That this is one of the main benefits of this kind of work. That it allows people to choose when to work, how often to work, to fit it around family life, to fit it around other forms of employment or other pursuits. And I think in many ways, this is the great strength of this work, is that for many people, traditional patterns of employment may not fit around what they want to do. And I think, when we consider the kind of mass experiment taking place for office workers at present, with many people working from home, many of us now have a glimpse of what greater flexibility at work looks like, and so can perhaps relate now in a new way to some of these benefits. Now, of course, flexibility in this context has come across as a kind of bargain for many workers. And in lots of contexts, that bargain for flexibility is about giving up employment rights. So giving up access to to the protections that people previously had. And I think this is one of the large challenges of the gig economy is understanding how that flexibility works for different stakeholders. Because of course, for workers in the gig economy, flexibility is a huge positive, but it also brings massive benefits to organizations in terms of how they organize very, very large workforces, how they pay for time on the job and pay for time off the job and so on. And so, this is the kind of one of the open questions of the gig economy, is how that bargain of flexibility continues to be negotiated. And I think, when we talk about the kind of great work at home experiment for many office workers, I think it's also important to draw attention to how many people in the gig economy are coping with COVID-19. Is having taken on many of the risks of the gig economy, during a moment like a global pandemic, there remains very little in terms of safety nets to support workers in this context. Now, on my final slide, I want to conclude really by drawing attention to this. As I said at the beginning, the gig economy is still only a fraction of overall work in the UK and globally. But I think the impact of this new kind of work goes far beyond people who are currently delivering food or driving people around the city. Is in this new context of work, there is a contest and in many ways a conflict over what the future of work could be. Is as there are these negotiations around how technology is used, what flexibility means, how to balance these new pros and cons of working. This will have an impact on people that work in the gig economy, of course. But as these methods and new management techniques, new ways of organizing things become successful, they will begin to be applied into other kinds of work. And so what happens in the gig economy matters not only for people who are currently in the gig economy, but also for organizations in the public sector, in the private sector, in kinds of work that involve new technology and kinds of work that we might think are more traditional. And so when we look at the future of work, it's incredibly important, I think, to draw attention to the experiences of workers in these new kinds of jobs, as well as the experiences of workers in more traditional forms of employment. Because as we come out of a pandemic, this is a question about what kind of work do we want? And the balance sheet for the gig economy at present, it definitely has some positives, but there are some very important challenges to draw attention to. And we should keep these in mind as we start to think about what work after the pandemic looks like, and how we can build a future of work that is equitable for all stakeholders. And yeah, the gig economy provides us with some very, very important signals for that. So thank you very much for listening to me today. I'm going to hand back over to Simon.
Thank you, Jamie. So I wanted to spend the last few minutes of this webinar really just talking around a particular case study, and that's how the Open University has been working with Uber over the last few months, as Uber have really tried to address one of those elements of the sort of flexibility within the gig economy, and also around the sort of lack of job retention and the types of areas. So back in October last year, Uber were extremely keen to retain their key drivers, their better drivers, which they clarify as Uber Pro drivers. And there's approximately around 25 to 30,000 of these drivers currently operating in the UK. And so what Uber did was introduce a comprehensive incentive program for these drivers, much of which focused on things that directly related to their jobs, such as better breakdown insurance or repairs, discounted petrol, etc. But the flagship element of that whole program was their partnership with the Open University, where for those drivers, they are providing access to free higher education. So in effect, the program allows a qualifying driver to study for a degree at the OU completely free of charge. Uber will pay all tuition fees related to that course. And probably furthermore, there's other similar schemes like this that have been running in the US, notably with people like Starbucks or Walmart, for example. But one of the big differences and sort of extras that Uber have put into this program is, should that driver, qualifying driver, not actually wish to uptake a degree study themselves, they can pass that credit on to a direct family member. That could be a spouse, could be a partner, could be a child, could even be a parent, and indeed also could be a sibling. When you consider that many Uber drivers are first-generation migrants, operating or in partnership with the OU, we're actually able to have a driver work in the UK, but fund a program for maybe a sibling or other family member who may still be residing in their birth country. And so we've been running this program. It's really officially launched in January this year. And to date, we have over 400 students started, enrolled with the Open University, and started courses and studying towards primarily degree packages as they move forward. And on the slide, you will see up in the top left-hand corner, there's a link to Skills Hub Online. That's actually the introductory pages to the program. But if you are interested in understanding more about the Learning as a Benefit programs that the Open University can offer, then that is a very good starting point to understand the range of subjects. Next slide, please. If you look, we've got here a couple of quotes. These are direct from Uber drivers in the UK. Rather than read these quotes out, I think the key message here is people are seeing this as very much a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They see it as a very positive way to not only significantly change their lives or the lives of a related family member. And I think for many, possibly the idea of studying for a UK degree, particularly in these current circumstances, has been an aspiration, but something that's been financially not affordable. Obviously, with this program, that then becomes achievable. Next slide, please. So just finally, I just wanted to briefly cover some of the areas that the Open University can help employers who are looking to look at how they may offer skills programs, education programs, retention programs to their employees moving forward, particularly that align to this new way of working and to the flexibility of study that is offered through an online provider like the OU. And so we have full range of activities and courses and options from Open Learn and Future Learn, which are our free educational resources where we feature over 10,000 hours of free content covering anything from basic math skills and English skills up to full postgraduate study, but also including a lot of short courses which are around new core skills, developing or reskilling, or indeed finding recognition for your existing skills. These are all a free resource that are available from the Open University. And then as we move into more formal study, we offer a full range of both undergraduate and postgraduate studies, vocational rewards, as well as a range of degree apprenticeships. I think one of the key things, as we've seen with the Learning as a Benefit program, is given that rich resource, both of free and paid assets and courses, backed by the knowledge of academic expertise, that we're able to develop learning programs that are very flexible and can be customized for the individual employer or employee's goals and objectives moving forward. So if you're interested in understanding more about some of the areas that we've talked here, or to explore what other learning options are available through the Open University, please speak today with one of our advisors who are currently online at the Open University's virtual exhibitions. And with that, can I thank you for your attention and listening to us, and equally thank you, Jamie, for your insights.